Well, good morning. Welcome to this New Statesman Fringe, hosted in association with the UK and a Changing Europe, Britain's leading impartial think tank on Brexit. And we, of course, are the UK's leading current affairs and politics magazine, so a likely pair. I won't speak for very long because nobody's here to listen to me, not least me. So we are here to discuss the question, notionally, and among other things, of how Labour will vote on the final Brexit deal. Obviously, Keir Starmer has answered that question for us this morning, so we'll talk around the issue of Brexit more generally. Questions like, how does Labour's position on Brexit differ from the Tories? I'm sure plenty of you will have an answer to that question in this room. Does Brexit represent a real threat to the Labour Party? What are the threats to Labour's electoral coalition? What sort of position should it adopt? What should it prioritise in negotiations with the EU? You know the script. And we've got a great panel this morning. Ben Bradshaw, former Cabinet Minister MP for Exeter. Caroline Flint, former Minister for Europe and MP for Don Valley. Stephen Kinnock, MP for Aberavon and member of the European Scrutiny Committee. And I believe you've got a book out.
I have indeed. Oh, thank you very much. Easy plug there, yes. There we are. I'll definitely plug it anyway, don't worry.
Good. And Anand Menon, who is the head honcho of UK and a Changing Europe and Professor of Politics at King's. So, without further ado, I'll invite each of the panellists to speak. Then we'll have a sort of longer powwow, and I'll take questions from the floor. And just to give advance warning, if it's more of a statement than a question, and you just want to make 6 short points, don't bother.
6 tests.
Six tests, yeah. Well, there we go. Anyway, Ben Bradshaw.
Right, sorry, I've only just seen the questions, so I'm going to stick to the script and try to answer these questions in turn. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, well, I'll shout. The first question is, how does Labour's position on Brexit differ from the Conservatives? Well, for a start, we're in favour of staying in a customs union. We're in favour of a transition. Neither of those things were supported by the government at the beginning. Each step of the way, Labour's position has changed, and the government has been forced to move with us on a transition, not yet on a customs union. And in the motion that we're going to be debating on the conference floor later today, we also add a new line on the single market, which is, in my view, is very welcome. I think it's about something like full alignment with the single market. And we also made quite clear in that motion what our position now is. What our position now is on the possibility of a people's vote in the event that Parliament votes down a deal. I don't think that's working, is it? Can you stop the clock? It is working. In the event that Parliament, it's not. It's patchy.
Sorry, that one.
In the event that Parliament votes down a deal, and we're in a kind of we're in a stasis, and there's no other way forward. And we've also made clear, thanks to Keir's clarification yesterday and again this morning, that Remain would have to be an option on any ballot paper in another referendum. What should Labour's Brexit priorities be? Well, our priorities all along, and I'm speaking as a front bench, not as a front bench person, obviously, but I'm trying to interpret the front bench's position. That is, our priorities have been to try to minimise the economic damage that Brexit would do to our economy, and particularly to working people. That's why we have always been in favour of staying closer to our European neighbours. They're our single biggest market. I don't need to tell anyone in this room what the impact would be of a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, and I think that's absolutely been the right place for our party to be. How does Brexit complicate the party's standing among Labour voters? Well, I think this is in flux. If you look at most of the recent polling, the biggest shift in views of voters from Leave to Remain is among Labour voters and among Labour voters in Labour constituencies that voted Leave. And that's no accident, because I think as people in those constituencies, particularly in areas like the North East, the North West and the Midlands, very dependent on manufacturing for their prosperity, are beginning to understand the reality of a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit on their communities and on their jobs. Those opinions are moving. And as we saw in the poll that was published over the weekend, a huge majority of Labour members and Labour voters now favour there being another referendum, if on a deal or no deal, and they would vote in favour of staying in. And that's why, as far as I'm concerned, it would have been absolutely ludicrous if we come out of this conference at the end of this week ruling any of those options out. In what circumstances would Labour advocate for a second referendum? Well, I think Keir spelled that out very clearly on the Today programme this morning. We've done so in our motion, which was composited the other night, in the event that Parliament votes down a deal, and I think that's a probability, not a possibility. I can't see Theresa May getting a deal through the House of Commons because if she goes softer than Chequers, the ERG will vote against it. If she goes harder than Chequers towards a Canada-style option, which is the latest rumours coming out of the Cabinet, then she'll lose not just those brave Tory rebels who've already voted with us on several occasions, but there are a lot more Tory MPs who, when push comes to shove, and they have to look into their constituents' whites of their eyes, am I going to vote to make you poorer? Am I going to vote for a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit? They will do the right thing when the time comes. So I can't see her getting a deal through Parliament. Of course, we in Labour say we want to have a general election. Of course we want a general election. We want a Labour government. There can only be a general election if Tory MPs vote for one. Under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, you need a two-thirds majority in the House of Commons for there to be a general election. It is not going to happen. The Tories are never going to vote for a general election on Brexit. Can you imagine how that election would run? It would complete civil war in the Tory party and a split worse than the one we've seen since the Corn Laws. So, the final question. If Labour rejects May's final deal, isn't the party condemning the country to a hard Brexit for political reasons? No. Parliament is sovereign. Parliament will stop a no-deal Brexit. Let's be absolutely clear about that. When Nick Robinson asked Keir this question on the Today programme this morning, he assumed that the alternative to supporting a bad, hard Brexit deal, if she manages to get one, is that we crash out. We don't. Parliament can table a motion, we can instruct the government, we can amend any motion that comes forward on a deal, including the provision for a referendum, and I think in those circumstances we would have a majority. And my message to colleagues like Caroline, and I know we disagree on a lot of this, is what is undemocratic? When we get to that point, when there's no deal that Parliament has approved and the alternative is crashing out, are we honestly going to say to the British people and to our voters, who are the ones who would suffer most in the chaos of no deal, that we're not going to give the British people a final say in that situation? I just don't. That could be a unifying position for the Labour Party. We could all rally around that, whatever our opinions on immigration and everything else, and I'm sure we'll come and talk about those in the future. But this is where I'm confident we will end up. And I'm absolutely delighted that this is where this conference this week is going to end up, with this historic policy, which I think has the potential to save our country from disaster.
Thanks very much, Ben. There was some vigorous head shaking from my left-hand side there, so I look forward to hearing what Caroline has to say in response.
Well, I respect Ben because Ben's always been very clear. He doesn't respect the referendum outcome of 2016 because he basically wants to turn it over. And at the heart of all this is about trust. And I was reminded this morning of the first leaflet that the Labour Party produced for last year's, let's not forget last year's general election, in which it actually said, this election...
I'm not sure. Maybe could you use Ben's handheld, maybe?
Does this not working? I'd rather use this. Okay, that's fine. The first leaflet in the last general election only a year ago, it said, this election is not about Brexit, the issue is decided. And it was on that basis that we fought the election. So how do we differ from the Tories on Brexit? Well, here's the problem. Labour has allowed this debate to be dominated by voices that repeatedly brand Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May as having the same approach on Brexit. So Labour doesn't get any credit for shifting the government's position. First, we have never entertained a no-deal or hard Brexit option. Second, we have always accepted the UK should settle its debts with the EU. Third, we have always argued for a transitional period, not a cliff edge. And fourth, we argued from the start that sincere negotiation requires compromise. And we've made several other gains as well, making Theresa May agree to EU citizens' rights and a commitment for no hard Northern Ireland border. The reason why we get no credit is that for some, the only deal that could ever be endorsed would be one that replicates EU membership. And that was part of the problem with the Norway amendment that we debated earlier this year, which means that nothing Theresa May brings back will be acceptable to some of my colleagues. Many of my colleagues stood at the general election last year promising to respect the referendum and to work for the best deal. Many added that they would oppose a Tory hard Brexit. But if a treaty, and look, I'm not underestimating the ups and downs we've had along the way, and I put a lot of the blame for that at the door of Theresa May and her government, but if a treaty produces workable arrangements to go forward, resolves the Northern Ireland border, EU citizens' rights and Brits abroad, a framework for ongoing business, and sets up for a bigger association agreement to be negotiated during the transition period, and if that deal is agreed by the UK and 27 member states, backed by Merkel, Macron and the Brussels bureaucracy, how can that be described as a Tory hard Brexit? It is looking likely that Labour will demand that MPs vote against any deal, and the reason will be Labour's 6 tests. Now, these tests are pretty vague and impossible to quantify, but the most specific one is ensuring some benefits currently enjoyed within the single market. Now, exactly what is a benefit and what is a cost is, again, impossible to quantify. And if the UK has powers thereafter over workers' rights, then how could any treaty guarantee a future UK policy? So, like Gordon Brown's tests for the euro, some of you may remember them, these can be played any way they want from the front bench. However, the decision at the end of the day has nothing to do with the merits of the deal. Rather, it's about voting down any deal that May brings to Parliament, and that has huge risks. It requires Tories or the UDP to vote for a no-confidence motion, and I don't think they will. So despite all this, Labour risks delivering the hardest Brexit that the hardest hardline Brexiteers want. So if I could just take 30 seconds more on this.
Sure.
So where will that leave the People's Vote campaign? Because there won't be a vote for a second referendum in Parliament, I'm sure of that. I fear that for some people, the People's Vote campaign was always a vehicle with 2 destinations in mind: a new referendum and the backstop to create a new centre party. That too will fail, but it will guarantee the Tories a majority for another decade. So I'm against a second referendum because it will not resolve the disagreements that surfaced in the first referendum. Very little of what has been said in Parliament shows any real empathy or concern for the working class voters, the Labour working class voters that voted Leave. And I'm disappointed when I hear MPs say, my voters didn't vote Leave to make themselves poorer. This argument is sounding very much like, you can't be trusted to know your own interests, we know best. I feel that a new referendum will divide voters again. It will tell Labour voters that if they voted Brexit, they may as well vote Tory, and that cannot be allowed to happen.
Thanks very much, Caroline. Stephen Kinnock, who applauded vigorously there, and look forward to hearing what exactly.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thanks very much to New Statesman and UK in a Changing Europe. I do agree absolutely that the work that Anand and his team are doing is absolutely vital in terms of giving a lot of us the information that we need. So many thanks for this invitation. But I do think Anand's also done a great job of just sort of lining up 3 positions within the Parliamentary Labour Party, and I'm the guy that's going to kind of try and navigate a course through the middle. So
I think I do that, actually.
Oh, right, okay. So,
I think you want the Norway option, which is the worst.
Yeah, presumptuous on my part. Yeah, I'll let you draw your own conclusions about that. So my starting point is to go right back to first principles. And I think the debate we're having now around Brexit is actually a debate about what is the point of politics and what is the point of the Labour Party in that context. And my starting point for that is that our country is more divided than it has been at any time since the Second World War. City versus town, young versus old, graduates versus non-graduates. We are deeply, deeply polarised and divided. And in that challenging situation, we have to ask ourselves, what is the point of the Labour Party and what is the point of politics more broadly? And I am a whole nation politician to my fingertips. I believe passionately that the point of politics is to reunite divided communities, to reunite a divided country, to sow the seeds of cohesion and harmony rather than division and polarisation. So if that's our starting point, that's the exam question. all of the answers and the decisions that we make now have to flow from that point. And if we take that as our starting point, my biggest concern about having another referendum is it will not achieve any of those things. It will be deeply, deeply divisive, it will polarize, and it will continue to push our communities apart from each other. So if we want to be a whole nation party that can reunite, then I think we have to take that as our starting point. And that is why, for the last 2 years, I have been arguing in favour of the European Economic Area as the best possible route for our country in terms of leaving the European Union. It reflects the mandate. In my opinion, a narrow vote for leave is a message from the electorate to Parliament to say we want to leave the political institutions and the deeper political project that many of the other member states of the European Union wish to pursue. We want a relationship with the European Union which reflects the very different historical, cultural and political narrative and story that our country has. We didn't sign the Treaty of Rome in 1958 because we weren't one of those countries that needed Europe to ride to its rescue like a knight in shining armour after what happened in the Second World War. So we've got a different historical and cultural relationship with the EU. I think we should have a relationship with the EU that reflects that. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for creating an outer ring of European countries, ourselves, the Nordics, some of the Central and Eastern European countries, that will never be in the euro, that will never sign up to the deeper political integration that's required to make that work, but want a constructive and productive relationship with the single market and the customs union. So the European Economic Area plus a form of customs union delivers that. It delivers the mandate of the referendum. It means leaving the EU. It does mean having the opportunity to have more control over free movement of labour. Articles 112 and 113 of the EEA agreement are crystal clear. An EEA country can invoke 112, which is an emergency brake on any one of the 4 freedoms that underpin the single market, and then renegotiate a different approach. I also hear people saying, well, Norway is, the EEA option is a vassal state. Not true. There is the EFTA court, which frequently diverges from the European Court of Justice. There's the EEA Joint Committee, the EFTA Surveillance Authority. There is a well-established, well-understood set of institutions and treaties that clarify the relationship between EEA states and the rest of the European Union. So if we want to have a deal that can reunite our deeply divided country, that solves the Northern Ireland border issue, that delivers a stable, clear and transparent future trading relationship, and which actually gives the opportunity for the EU to use Brexit as a reset moment to do the kind of things that President Macron has been talking about in terms of creating a multi-tier Europe, more decentralised, more flexible, then an EEA-based Brexit is the only viable option. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And now Anand, who, according to his name, his name tag has been elected to Parliament. Oh, okay. Anyway,
Congratulations, mate. Congratulations.
I see it as a demotion. Thank you very much. I think I'll just make a few comments on the basis of being a sort of critical friend and react to some of the things I've heard. I had this fight with Stephen about EEA the other day, but it still eludes me how...
We can't hear you at all.
That's probably a blessing.
Shall I maybe try this? Does that work?
Can you hear that? Yeah, all right. I mean, it still eludes me how a fair reflection of a referendum fought on the basis of a campaign to take back control can conceivably end in EEA, which is the worst of all conceivable worlds in terms of control, whatever the economic merits it might bring. And I just think there's a problem with that. I'm also not as sanguine as Ben about Parliament's chances of stopping a hard Brexit if it votes down the withdrawal bill. I think there will be a real danger of us crashing out unless that's very, very carefully thought through. We could talk about that in questions. Now, obviously, on one level, Labour's policy on Brexit is very different to the Tory policy on Brexit because Labour policy on Brexit is to oppose everything the Tories do on Brexit. But that's about it. But under the surface, there are real similarities, and the similarities lie in the use of weasel words and the desire for cake. Labour's policy on Brexit, insofar as I've followed it, is we're going to be in a customs union where we have a say over trade deals. That will never be on offer. And we're going to have all the benefits of the single market while stopping free movement and conceivably opting out of state aid rules, which will also never, ever be on offer. So there is a similarity between both parties in that neither one is actually spelling out the trade-offs that are going to be involved in negotiating a Brexit deal. What I would say, though, from the Labour point of view is it works. Labour's stance on Brexit works. Why does it work? Because if you stand on the sidelines saying, we accept the referendum, but we would do it better than the Tories, it's quite a powerful message. Okay, not least because it's hard to imagine anyone doing it worse than the Tories. And this is opposition politics 101, isn't it? Which is, we think the government is useless. We would do it better than them. We're not ready to tell you precisely how yet. But that's how oppositions work, and that's how oppositions win. So as a strategy for opposition, this strikes me as sensible, because most people in the general public don't follow the details of the customs union debate. And what they'll remember from this is that Jeremy Corbyn said he'd have done it in such a way to preserve jobs. The big question is whether you think Brexit is just another policy or not. There are some people who would argue Brexit is a once-in-a-generation challenge. We can't just treat it like a policy. We need to suspend the normal rules of political opposition because this is going to transform our country and we need to oppose it. If you think that, then fair enough. But it strikes me that as an opposition strategy, what Labour's doing is make sense. And bear in mind that those people in the Labour Party who oppose a referendum, I mean, there are a lot of sort of very simplistic arguments, oh, they just want to leave. There are very good reasons to be sceptical about what would happen in another referendum. Firstly, forget the idea that it would be clear. People say, oh, the second referendum, we'll know exactly what we're voting on. It'll be far, far better than the first. We're not going to have a trade deal to vote on for 5 or 10 years. We will have a few pieces of paper called a political declaration that will make the composite motion look clear and well written. It will be impossible to know what the future holds, and in that sense the referendum will be a rerun of the first. Secondly, imagine if we have this second referendum and it leads to a result that is 52-48 in favour of Remain on a lower turnout than 2016. Where does that put us as a country and with our politics? And the final thing I would say is, one of the strengths of the Corbyn project, for me, is that it is a movement that in part is aimed at reconnecting politics with a people that had lost faith in politics over previous decades. It's not a good look for a movement that's founded on that belief to say, let's have that vote again because we think you got it wrong last time. And I think the implications for the Corbyn movement in that case could be quite damaging. So if you believe that Brexit needs to be stopped, then campaigning for a second referendum is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but don't fall into the trap of thinking it's going to be easy or that it will be easy for the Labour Party. So the final point I'd say is, and I think this is the real crying shame about Brexit, is that neither of our big political parties have done what absolutely needs to be done, which is to define a credible post-Brexit vision for Britain. Brexit is going to change our country. Whether you support it or not is irrelevant. It will change our economy, it will change our constitution, it will change how we work on a very, very practical level. We'll have to learn to do things differently. Both parties are acting as if it'll be business as usual afterwards, and it won't. And I think the big gap in British politics at the moment is a compelling vision for how, given what Brexit will mean to our country, we need to start doing things differently afterwards.
Thank you very much. Lots to chew over there. I'm sure there'll be plenty of disagreement, at least, on the panel, and then we'll feed back to you for questions. So Ben, I heard you a few murmurs of discontent as Anand spoke there. I wondered if you wanted to come back on any of those points.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anand's right. The Labour policy of constructive... Can you hear me? The Labour policy of... Yeah.
Do you want to share us?
Can you hear me now? No?
Bellow.
Okay. Anand's right. Okay.
The
Labour policy of constructive ambiguity has served us well up until now. But we've got 3 weeks. We've got 3 weeks until the government has to reach a deal. And in March next year, we face the danger of crashing out or a hard Brexit. So you can only stretch constructive ambiguity so far, and that's why I think we have to make a decision, and I think we will. I think we'll vote down a Tory deal in Parliament, and as I say, I think
when that doesn't go through. And Tom Newton-Dunn, who knows the Tory MPs better than me, tweeted last night that there were between 70 and 100 Tory MPs who would vote for an amendment in the House of Commons to the Brexit bill in favour of a referendum. Now, I think that's probably rather over-optimistic,
Yes.
but there are certainly more than the 18 or so who have so far rebelled. So I think he's also too pessimistic about the prospect of getting another referendum through the House of Commons. Stephen, I would much rather have Norway than a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit. And I don't accept the arguments of those who say it's the worst of all possible worlds, because it's the one that does least damage to our economy. But I think that ship has sailed. I think, paradoxically, if Theresa May had come to the country after last year's general election with a bit of humility and said, I've lost my majority, the referendum was finely balanced, the way to bring the country back together is to go for this sort of option, I think she could have got it through Parliament. I think we would have had to vote for it. I wouldn't have done, but most Labour MPs would, and she would have got a majority. She's not going to do that now. There's too much bad blood, both on the Tory side, and there's too much water now under the bridge. In honesty, that would still be my second preference to not leaving at all. And the final argument that the referendum would be divisive. The country is divided. The country is divided. The country's never been more divided. And if we face a situation where Parliament cannot agree on a deal, and we're facing the prospect of a cliff-edge Brexit, what is going to divide this country more? It's going to be much more likely to be divided if we fall off a cliff, with all of the economic disaster that causes, than if we say to the people, you started this process off, you've got to finish it off. That would be a recipe for bringing people back together in the Labour Party, whatever our views, because we'd be given that decision to the people in a referendum.
Caroline, anything you want to come back on from any of the previous speeches?
Well, one, the problem is, I campaigned for Remain in a Leave seat, and I have to say that, when I see comments about MPs like myself, sorry? Right. Hello, Manchester! Do they hear it there, for fuck's sake? Right, okay, so, wake up at the back. Okay. I had a little interruption there. So, I campaigned for Remain in a Leave seat. I have to say, there was little support for most of us in those Leave seats in our campaigning. There was little resources, and quite frankly, the Remain campaign was absolutely useless. They weren't listening, not to people, not just to me, but other people who said you are completely in cloud cuckoo land in terms of your expectations in this Remain campaign. They didn't listen. They trotted out men in suits. They didn't address the issues of concerns, and those concerns have been building up over a long period of time. And the thing is that, at the end of that referendum, the Labour Party said, we respect the vote, and I said that. And as I said earlier, only a year ago in a leaflet, the first Labour leaflet said, we respect the vote, Brexit is over, that's it, we're leaving, we've got to get the best deal. Now, what we've had in Parliament is, basically, a lot of the efforts and energy people were putting in is not to get a good deal, it's to try and rerun the arguments of the referendum which were lost. And I just feel that in that context, it's very much saying that, we can keep trying and putting these same arguments, and you know what? We'll keep having a referendum until we get the right result, because that's how it comes across, not just to Leave voters, but to many Remain voters out there, for whom I have to say 4 out of 10 wanted changes to freedom of movement. So they weren't exactly, loved up to the whole project. And I think we are doing a disservice if we just move forward without taking that into account. The truth is, we hear about a cliff edge, but I can sort of remember 2 years ago when colleagues were saying, we can't just sort of, vote for Article 50 and think we're all going to get it done by then. We're going to have a transition period. And at that point, Theresa May wasn't supporting that. When we get a transition period or an implementation period or whatever you want to call it, suddenly some of my colleagues move the goalposts again and try and find some other way to talk about hard Brexit and a cliff edge. The honest truth is, and this is one of the big problems about a referendum on the deal, and let's be clear about it, it's not deal, no deal. Some people actually have the argument about just staying in the European Union. There's not just one deal. There's going to be many deals. The first issue is about the principles of the divorce. Then, as we are in the implementation period, there will be another number of other deals on trade, as Anand said. So I don't know how you think you're going to wrap that up in a package to put to people at come whatever, January next year. It's just not possible. And in the meantime, I think we are doing a disservice to those many communities who, quite frankly, as members of the EU, they weren't safe from austerity. The EU didn't save them in terms of what was happening to their communities. And you're asking them to trust them that they voted leave, that somehow they got that all wrong, and that their future is going to be better off in the EU. Now, you can argue about that till the cows come home. But those communities don't believe that. That's why they voted in the way they did, and that's why they need something more from the Labour Party than refighting the arguments of 2 years ago.
Stephen, a divided country, no clear route forward for Labour? Sounds like a good subject for a book, no?
You keep plugging that book. I'm very grateful to you for doing so. I think one thing it's really important to make clear is because of the utterly incompetent way in which this government is managing the negotiations, we are getting dangerously close to a no-deal scenario. And there's no doubt at all that no deal would be a catastrophe for the British economy. As a member of the Brexit Select Committee, I've been down to Dover. I've seen the port there. I've seen the 10,000 lorries a day that go through that port. If they're not put through a frictionless customs union type arrangement, you will have absolute gridlock and chaos. That's just one example of what it means in practice. So if we end up in a no-deal scenario, there is no majority for that in Parliament. I think the Prime Minister might be bounced into having to have a referendum because it'll be our only way out. Remain must be on the ballot paper, and let me be absolutely clear, if it is a choice between no deal at all and remaining in the EU, I will be campaigning tooth and nail for us to stay in the EU. But I remain of the view...
But would you vote for a deal?
But I remain of the view, and what I will not vote for as well is a blind Brexit. Yeah. What I think is going to happen is that she's going to come back with... If they can sort something on Northern Ireland, I still don't see how they do that whilst keeping the DUP on board. Then the divorce items are sorted, and then there will be a vanilla, completely meaningless motherhood and apple pie political declaration on the future relationship, which means nothing at all. I will not vote for a blind Brexit because that's a massive leap of faith. The only form of Brexit I will vote for is an EEA-based Brexit. I say EEA-based, I think it's really important that we don't say it's going to be a copy and paste of the EEA. We will change the nature of the relationship between that outer ring of countries and the EU by joining it. So dealing with the EU is like building a house. You have to agree on the basic foundations and the blueprint for the house. You can then have a big argument about the doors and the windows and the colour of the curtains. And there's no doubt in my mind that if we move to the foundations and the blueprint, which is based on EEA plus a customs union, get that into the political declaration, we then have we're in a really good position to negotiate a more bespoke deal that works for our country and that reflects the fact that we are clearly a very different place a very different country to Norway. So I think the fundamental point is, and I go back to this, yes, we are a deeply divided country. The key purpose of politics, in my view, is to avoid deepening divisions, to avoid polarising communities. And I just really hope that we will all 650 MPs will bear that in mind as we go through the next days, weeks and months.
Thank you very much. And just before I bring you back in, Anand, I just wanted to ask you a quick question of the MPs on the panel. It's often assumed by optimistic people in Downing Street and lazy journalists that whatever deal May brings back might squeeze through with Labour, the votes of pro-EU Labour MPs who would rather take any deal with the EU to avert to no deal, rather than the cliff edge that you mentioned, Ben. So I just wondered, in turn, if any of you could say there were any circumstances in which you would vote for a deal Theresa May brought back.
No. No. I wouldn't. Karen is actually wrong. I did respect the referendum result, but I also thought we could always change it and that the public had a right to change their mind. So that's always been my position. I voted against Article 50. I will not vote for any deal. If I was not going to get a referendum to keep us in, I'd go with Stephen on the EEA. I think it's much more likely that the people who vote with the government, and I hope this isn't the case, Caroline, will be those people on some on the old right, one or two on the old hard left who have actually broken the Labour whip already, some of them, albeit in very small numbers. But I hope when it comes to a vote which could defeat the government, that will focus all Labour MPs' attention and concentrate on that goal and prize of defeating the government, getting another referendum. After a referendum, I think there will be a general election. So imagine if we have a referendum to stop Brexit, that's the end of the Tory government. The Tory party will implode anyway, but let's have that referendum to stop Brexit first. There's not going to be a general election before Brexit or before a referendum, so that for me is the sensible sequencing. Incidentally, Nick Robinson made another mistake on the Today programme this morning when he assumed that it would be the ERG, that hard-right Tory Brexiteers, who would vote with us against a Brexit deal. I think it's just as likely to be those 70 to 100 Tory remainders that Tom Newton-Dunn, the Sun political editor, talked about in his tweet last night. Because if she goes to Canada now, if she goes towards a Canada deal, they are not going to vote for that. So one way or another, I do not see her getting a deal through Parliament.
Thanks very much. Caroline?
Well, let's wait and see. I mean, look, nobody on this panel is going to champion the government's handling of all of this. I think on that we're all agreed. And actually, I do agree with something that Stephen said. I fundamentally still believe, and who knows, I might be wrong. I don't hold a monopoly on truth or foresight, but I still believe some bespoke deal will be put together. And it can't be like the Norway arrangement, which also, let's throw in Liechtenstein into that as well. These are small countries compared to the UK, and having been in Oslo just the other week and speaking to some friends there, they had two opportunities to join the EU and they turned it down. And actually pro-Europeans in Norway say to me, we don't really want to revisit that area because we're not sure we want to sort of have that situation where actually our population want to unpick the deal we got. And the truth is, Norway was the example in the referendum campaign that all of us were told to talk about because they're saying you don't want to end up like Norway, which is all the rules, all the conditions, and no say. And freedom of movement, and we might come on that with questions, Patrick, is a massive issue in this. People will not accept that we will have a situation where we have to rely on 27 other member states to tell us what we can or cannot do when it comes to any changes to freedom of movement. As for the deal, I mean, look, for some people, there will never be a deal. They will find some way, politicians' way, to say there will be no deal that's ever good enough. And I just think there's a thing about integrity here. I really do. Because I think when we set up tests about what we think is a reasonable way forward a deal, we're hearing now about vanilla deals, blind Brexits and this hard. Look, we want a reasonable deal that deals with some of the top line issues we as Labour members are concerned about. At the same time, like workers' rights, like some of the standards, aligning ourselves and all of that, about trade and what have you, but also an ongoing positive relationship with our European Union friends. Now, I can't preempt what she's going to come back with because, every time I think something's going to happen next week, things change. But I think the Labour Party, and that includes me and every member of Parliament for the Labour Party and the front bench, have to ask themselves, if a deal comes back that does pretty much tick the boxes that we've been arguing for, if we're going to vote that down, we have to be pretty clear about why that is. Now, I know some in our party just want a general election. I've heard about these so-called Tory Remainers rallying to Labour's cause time and time ago over votes in Parliament, and they haven't. They haven't. So we're going to have to deal with the reality as it presents ourselves and keep in mind the integrity of what we have said and what we're trying to do here, which is to manage a very difficult issue, an issue that has divided the country, but actually in the short term and medium term allows us as far as possible, and there will have to be change, and Anna's absolutely right about that, we can't expect our cake and eat it, but to try and actually manage this process in the best way we can, given the referendum that we had. And I just think that is vitally important to the integrity of the Labour Party and the integrity of ourselves as politicians.
Thanks, Caroline. Stephen, snappily, if you will, so Anand can come back in and we can take questions from the floor.
Look, I think what's come up quite a bit is what's Labour's position on And one of the fundamental challenges we have is that I agree with Anand. Our position has basically just been to oppose everything that the Tories have done and said. I don't think that that's a sustainable position. And to Caroline's point, what's going to happen in the autumn is that there will be an amendable motion on the withdrawal. And that will be amendable. The key word there is we're going to have to put in some kind of reasoned amendment which explains why we're not voting for the deal. Keir Starmer's made it clear we will be whipped to vote against whatever deal Theresa May brings back. Well, you'd need, being in opposition is two things. I think opposition 101 is saying, yes, you oppose the government, you hold it to account and you criticise it, but you also, when the journalist puts the microphone under your nose and says, well, what would you do? You need an answer to that question. And we are falling into a trap here, because if we are framed and put up there as the party that's just putting party before country and voting against Theresa May's deal just because we want to trigger a general election, there is a real risk of a backlash from the country, because we haven't put forward a clear and compelling alternative vision and our view of how we would achieve Brexit. Yes, we've got the 6 tests, and they're fine in terms of what we want to see, but you can't just have a what without a how. You've got to have, this is how we would do it, and that how, of course, has to be rooted in reality. And the reality that our political leadership has utterly failed to see throughout all this is that the European Union is a disciplined, organised, well-coordinated negotiator that has eaten the British government for breakfast. And when we have a position which says our 6 tests, fine, but they're not really going to get us very far unless we explain how we're going to do it. That has to be based on a model. When you deal with the European Union, you don't just pull a rabbit out of a hat and create some novel new thing. That is what our government has learned to its cost. We needed to settle on a model, the foundations of the house, from an early stage, and then build the negotiation on that basis. I don't believe the ship has sailed. I still believe that there is time. If you read what Nicky Morgan and Stephen Hammond have written in the press over the last 24 hours, coming out very strongly for an EEA-based option. We had 76 Labour MPs defying the whip to vote for the EEA. If we'd been whipped to vote in favour of it, we would have had many, many more than that. I think there is a cross-party majority for this, and I think when we get to a point of there being no deal at all, it's time to mobilise Plan B.
Anand?
I just wonder, I take what Stephen says about negotiating a sort of bespoke EEA. We haven't got time to buy a house now, between now and when these votes happen.
On the foundations.
But the foundation will be the EEA as it is, which means you're voting for freedom of movement. And I do not think there is a majority in the House of Commons that will sign up to freedom of movement. I just don't see that happening.
Article 112.
Well, okay, we can argue about that. Let's do that later.
Yeah, we'll argue about it.
But I think ultimately, the thing about blind Brexit is the laws of the European Union means the only sort of exit is blind, because they won't negotiate trade till you've left. It has to be blind. It has to be blind by law. We will never know what they will negotiate with us, because the people that negotiate trade for the European Union will be a different bunch of people to the people who negotiate Brexit. And they can't tie the hands of the other set of negotiators. It's just the way the European Union has designed the system for leaving is, unsurprisingly, a nightmare for the state that's leaving. That's just what the rules determine. And just a couple of things for Ben. On the ERG point, I see what you're saying. I just wonder whether, if you imagine Dominic Grieve or Nicky Morgan at home yesterday listening to John McDonnell, okay, and thinking to themselves, if we vote against the Prime Minister's Brexit deal, it becomes significantly more likely that he becomes Chancellor. Whether or not ultimately a whole load of those Tories that Tom Newton-Dunn is thinking about will think, actually, at the end of the day, we'll keep the Tories in government even if we have a really bad Brexit deal as the price for doing that. And the final question for all of you is, in the event that we had a second referendum, do you think the Labour leadership would come out unambiguously for Remain?
No. No.
Well, with that rare moment of unanimity, let's.
Well, they don't want. Well, clearly, in terms of the conversations I've been listening to on the radio, they can't actually work out whether they're going to have the third question on a ballot paper, which is about Remain. It's deal, no deal.
And on that note, let's open it up to questions from the floor. Do we have we'll take 3 at a time. Do we have a microphone in the audience?
Got about 4 in.
10 minutes.
Good luck, Andy.
background.
God. Okay, we'll take three. Three people sat down in the middle, so lady there, fellow with the specs on, and the lady in the blue top at the back.
I think maybe just stand and shout.
I think so.
Stand and shout.
Oh, look at this. Collective action.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Liz, I'm from Politics Home. I just wanted to ask you, in the kind of dream scenario where Jeremy Corbyn ends up as Prime Minister and he's the one that's negotiating the Brexit deal, how much confidence do you have that he would be better at getting a deal than Theresa May? Or would get a better deal than Theresa May, should I say?
My big question is that there's a strong possibility that the government ain't going to get anything agreed with the EU in next month, meaning that I don't think I don't think it's probably going to be even a special summit by November. Is there a possibility that by basically the government going, we're going to go for a no deal, nothing will go through the House of nothing will appear in the House of Commons basically that can be amended, meaning that we're going to crash out regardless.
Hi, Tess Finch-Lees. I'm speaking as an immigrant, and I think in response to Caroline's point, I'd like to make the point that I think going into the referendum we were starting from a very low base because Labour had failed historically to make the case for immigration and for immigrants. And two words I haven't heard anyone mention, which are very key and important in this. We talk about integrity. What about the fraud that predicated the referendum results, which is now widely known? And secondly, the thing that was never mentioned in the referendum and is not mentioned here again today, Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. How do you square that circle?
Thanks very much. So, Ben, do you want to come back on that? Oh no, Caroline, actually, do you want to come back on that? Because that question was directed in your direction.
Look, I just find sometimes when we discuss immigration, you get a polarisation in the debate, which is either you're entirely for it, you're entirely against it, and that's just not the case. There is nothing, if you like, there's nothing outside of our Labour values against having a fair and reasonable immigration policy. And when I've surveyed my own constituents, they're not against all immigration. And actually, national polling shows that people aren't against all immigration. And if we talk about the European Union freedom movement, they can see the case that where we need it in terms of certain sectors and of our economy, that should be provided for. But they want to know that it's managed well. And the truth is some aspects of the freedom movement have been more to the benefit of companies than they have been of communities. And we have had, I supported ID cards, and I still support ID cards. I think I've still got one I had when I took it out at the time. But we have had an immigration service, not just in terms of managing the rules around freedom of movement, but also outside of Europe, that has been poorly funded, poorly served, and then we end up with some of the chaos we've seen in terms of this hostile environment, what happened to Windrush. So I think it's about having a debate that listens to the concerns. And the problem about the Labour Party is for 10 years or more, we actually didn't deal with some of these issues, and then we're expecting all those people who have concerns about this to be completely ignored when we have a referendum call by David Cameron and we have a 6-week campaign. And the Remain campaign just didn't want to discuss immigration at all because they did their surveys and polling and focus groups and they knew it was a non-starter for them. So you can't get away from this. And that's the reality of where we are. When we leave the European Union, and this is a problem again with Stephen's advocacy of the Norway EEA, it doesn't mean there's no migration from the EU going forward. But if there's some change to the rules around freedom of movement, people don't see that change, not in some fluffy, spin-doctory way, but in a real substantial way, people will not accept that we've actually honoured the outcome of that referendum. And I just think that is vitally important in all this. And we have to have a grown-up debate about migration and immigration that has a fair and managed system that we can feel actually we can get support those people who come and work here and what they do, but at the same time deal with situations where, quite frankly, the access to labour, which you can pay less, exploit more, is one of the things that I, as a Labour Party member, have fought against for many years. It's why we believe in workers' rights. And there is no doubt that there are some companies, large and small, who've taken the mick, quite frankly, when it's come to recruiting labour from overseas, whether that's actually from the European Union or elsewhere. And that has to change.
Ben?
The colleague who asked about migration, the government's own report last week showed that EU migrants have made a massively bigger contribution to our economy than they have in services that they've used, massively more, and they also completely exploded the myth that they have displaced British workers or depressed wages. We need to take those immigration myths head on. Yes, we need control, and Stephen's absolutely right. There's plenty that we could do already that we don't do in Britain to implement Article 50, to implement the freedom of labour rules. Labour, incidentally, not movement. Freedom of labour rules better. We could have the 4-year waiting period like they do in many other continental countries. We could use the powers that we never have and we've never explained to the British public. The person who asked the question about whether Jeremy Corbyn would make a better fist, well, of course he would, because we wouldn't have these ridiculous red lines. I think Labour would be negotiating the kind of deal, if we were in government, that Stephen talks about, but we're not going to get a general election. I mean, I don't know how often this needs to be repeated. Of course, the leadership has to say we want a general election, and that's what we will call for when she doesn't get a deal through Parliament, but Tory MPs are not going to vote for a general election. End of. They're not. So forget about it. So we're going to have to sort out the Brexit stuff before there's a general election. Finally, the very important point that the gentleman made about what happens in Parliament in the event of no deal. Parliament is sovereign in this country, thank goodness. Parliament will take back control. We will find a mechanism, and there's a lot of discussions going on about this, to instruct the government. And one of the reasons the Tory backbenchers, have tried to get rid of John Bercow is he will help us in this. He will ensure that Parliament, which is sovereign and forces the government's hand. So it's not a no-deal Brexit or nothing, because Parliament will take back control.
Thanks, Ben. Stephen, Anand, just sort of a minute each so we can take one more round of questions.
Right, on whether or not Jeremy would do a better job, yes, because he's committed to a customs union. Yeah. So that's already a big step in the right direction. Will there be nothing to vote on? Well, we have got an amendment that went through eventually with lots of negotiation from Dominic Grieve, which says if there is no deal by the 21st of January, the government must come to Parliament with a statement about what it intends to do next. That will be an amendable motion, and that is when we have to then decide what we want to do as a Parliament. So the government is tied into a 21st of January deadline, which is literally what you call squeaky bum time. On immigration, one of the points we make in the book, which I'm now going to shamelessly plug, is that there's these massive divisions in our country, and there's two tribes. There's the sort of younger, graduate, urban, socially liberal, and then there is the older, often non-graduate, living in towns and rural areas that we call we call this the cosmopolitans and the communitarians. Labour has fundamentally lost touch with its communitarian heartlands. If you look over the years, how we've just said to them, well, globalisation is just a force of nature. Mass immigration is just a force of nature. There's nothing we can do to regulate, to harmonise, to build it in a way that it builds cohesive communities, where there is public support and democratic consent for what's going on. And I think we have to now clearly say, look, we understand why people voted for Brexit. We're not dismissing the 17 million people that voted for Brexit as being wrong or ignorant or stupid. They voted in many ways very rationally. They said, you're telling me to vote for staying, for Remain because we want to protect the recovery. Which recovery is that? All I've seen in my communities for decades is decline, and all I've seen is massive change in my communities that I didn't sign up for. So we have to address the causes of Brexit. That means getting the right kind of Brexit now, but also making sure that we have a compelling vision, and lots of what was in our manifesto is absolutely right. There's still a lot more work to do on it. The brilliant work that the IPPR has just come out with, these are the things we've got to put forward so that we build a stronger economy and we rebuild trust in the immigration system, because that's the only way that we're going to build cohesive communities.
Yeah, I'll do that if you want. I just want to talk about But firstly, I have to say, because I'm a pedantic old fart, it's not literally squeaky bum time, is it? It's not literal. It's metaphorically, yeah. Right, on Corbyn, and let's do this without being ad hominem about his skills as a negotiator. Negotiating Brexit is an absolute nightmare. Whoever was doing it, however large their majority was, negotiating Brexit in 2 years would be hell, because there's just so much to do. And he's hampered by the fact that his own Brexit position contains the cakeism that the Tories do. He wants a customs union, yes, but he wants a vote on trade. The EU won't offer that. He wants the benefits of the single market, yes, but he wants to end free movement. The EU won't offer that. And on the other side of the table, you have an EU that, whilst it might not want to punish us, won't be wholly upset if we suffer a bit. Right? I mean, that's the kind of position the EU has. Of course, we don't want to punish you, but we don't want you to be better off than you were when you were inside. So a bit of pain would look good to keep the other members in line. So it's a hard thing to do. On Northern Ireland, let me say a couple of things. Well, one thing really, it's a nightmare, because essentially what you have to do is draft phrasing in the withdrawal agreement that will convince Dublin that the backstop will be used and convince Tory MPs that it won't, in the same piece of paper. I suspect they'll try and find a way to do that, but the best they're going to come up with is some kind of holding situation that pleases Dublin more than it pleases the Conservative Party, and how they get that through Parliament, I really do not know.
Thanks very much. Just have 3 more questions. So the chap at the back there in the blue-grey shirt, the lady next to you there, Dominic, and the chap in the middle there.
I want the panel to reply to these to this case. Brexit needs to be start again. There was criminality involved in the Brexit vote. We now know that the Leave campaign broke electoral law by expenditure. We know that Leave.U is funded by dark Russian money. We also suspect that there's criminality involved with Cambridge Analytica, along with the nexus of people around Putin, Trump and Farage. And thirdly, the Leave campaign gave absolutely no pathway as to how Brexit will be implemented, unlike the SNP in Scotland in the Scottish referendum. That is why I advocate a second referendum with the motion, with the option to remain. What does the panel think?
Yep, thanks. If you can just keep them snappy, because we are very pushed for time.
My question is, we've had people in communities with years of deprivation, which I was late, perhaps I missed it, wasn't talked about. That has influenced the way people will vote. We know that polls are notoriously unreliable. People are saying to me, well, you know, we'll get a yes vote. What if we don't? And I'm not really hearing anybody saying other than, well, we won't accept anything. You've got to be realistic. People have been influenced by that disadvantage. It has made them anti-immigration, and it has polarised them, and a poll is not reliable of what's going to happen.
Just chap in the middle there.
I don't quite understand your argument about Parliament being sovereign, which could prevent a no deal, because surely if May's deal doesn't go through Parliament, isn't the ball then in the EU's court? Because if 29th March comes, won't we crash out unless all 27 member states agree on extending the negotiation period?
Ben, do you want to come back to that?
Firstly, on the criminality, look, I'll take that one, because I was the first member of Parliament to raise the possibility that there'd been Kremlin meddling in our referendum, and everyone thought I was mad. Well, it doesn't look so mad now. There's a lot more to come out about this, by the way, much more than has already come out. I think Mueller is going to come out with some very explosive revelations about the nexus, as it was referred to, between Trump, the Leave campaign, and the Kremlin. So watch this space. However, I don't think that is not where we need to win the argument. You know, if that happens, great. It could be a game changer. We have to win the political argument on this. So please don't just think that, you know, what Mueller's going to come up with is going to save us. We need to win the political argument. On the question about Parliament, yes, but look, we can withdraw the letter unilaterally. Theresa May could do it now. She could do it when she loses the vote in January or November. And the idea that the European 27 are not going to give us more time is for the birds. They've all made clear they would give us more time, and they would welcome us changing their mind. What they're very reluctant to do is look as if they're pushing us or encouraging us towards that other referendum. They've always made quite clear the door would be left open. And then the woman who talked about poverty and deprivation, you're absolutely right. And we did talk about that a little bit earlier. And we haven't got very much time, and I'm sorry to use or distort a slogan that brought us to power in 1997, but we need to be tough on Brexit and tough on the causes of Brexit.
Thanks very much, Ben. Far from having not very much time, we've actually run out of time. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. It's been a spirited and lively discussion and plenty to think about as we debate Brexit today. So cheers.